What's up, everyone? Andy here. And I quickly wanted to thank you for purchasing the Tier 1 Peaking Methods book, as well as subscribing to the YouTube channel and following this video that is analogous to the book itself. So today we're going to be going over the Introduction to Performance Vibe Concepts and the Tier 1 Peak. It's going to encompass 9 chapters. Forward. In dedication to all the clients, friends, and supporting members of the Performance Vibe community. In no culture is it easy to be vastly different, and the reaffirmation brought about by everyone is amongst the truest reasons behind our recent growth. We are exuberantly grateful that there's an opportunity to showcase what we believe in. This is the first book in a tiered trilogy of peaking protocols used at the Performance Vibe. Each book will be accompanied with a sample program of the respective peaking protocol, as well as specific and unique content to enhance understanding. The first goal of this book is to highlight the miraculous aspects of the performance organism and its relationship with the human mind. The second goal is to expose the reader to Performance Vibe perspective on biology and training. The Tier 1 Peak is the most utilized peaking process at the Performance Vibe and acts as a wonderful practical platform for the information covered in this book to be seen as real. Thank you very much for supporting the Performance Vibe and being open-minded enough to pioneer into the next age of modern-day exercise science. Chapter 1, The Human Essentials. From birth onward, we are on a quest to discover, feel, and interact with the surrounding world. The word quest is appropriate because of specific human traits that we cannot divorce from. Humans have been able to function and evolve as a species because of the ability to act with foresight. As unfathomable as it may be, it is very well studied that babies are born with reflexes to search for a nipple, grip, and respond to foot stimulation, as well as select behavior strategies that cause change. Crying is a perfectly valid form of communication for babies, as they cannot do much else, but more importantly, they are expressing disapproval with the scenario. In fact, most times babies are not crying because of pain or perhaps desire. It is often in discontentment with the outcome. The concept of having reflexes suggests that we are innately prepared to behave anticipatorily. The term stress response organism is a common Performance Vibe reference for humans because when taken at face value, the logic is irrefutable. Making the choice to use the word organism as it is broad enough to allow for comparison to other species biologically. Categorizing us as humans creates a connotation that can lead to a biased outlook when using comparison. Stress response makes sense for 2 major reasons. The first includes what happens just before, during, and after a stressful event. We will use a resistance training example for comfort's sake. Say you are excited for a high-rep deadlift session. Prior to engaging in the lift, you will experience an anticipatory rise in heart rate and blood pressure to ensure that the extreme changes in either are not too drastic. This involves acute stiffening of some key vessels, along with the loosening of others, blood leaving the stomach, and changes in systemic chemistry. If you went from a resting state directly into a top set of deadlifts, without a single doubt, your heart would explode. Amidst your top set, endogenous cannabinoids are secreted to modulate the perception of pain. This endogenous cannabinoid release is part of the chemical phenomena that allows for incredible feats in sports. There's a valid but short-lived chemical change in the brain associated with participating in a lift you deeply care about. Deep care and mindfulness are often the limiting factor in advantageous hormone response associated with a performance scenario. After the training session is completed, the neurons, or the cellular units of the brain, associated with your deadlift continue to stay active. The continued activity of these neurons is what allows us to learn from session to session. Learning as a whole is largely centered on novelty. This manifests in a fantastic manner when extremely novice lifters commit to a goal and begin training for the first time. Over the course of 2 months, a novice can put 30 to 50 pounds on any given lift. To drive efficacy, this phenomenon can be controlled and replicated. Think about the drastic change in ability from learning any frivolous skill from the first to the second and third time it is attempted. In a microcosmic way, this explains the underlying cosmic concept behind progressive overload as a law of periodization. These real-world happenings are wonderful displays of neuronal effort. The brain is not a stagnant organ. It is more similar to skeletal muscle than anything in your gut. Just like muscle, we see neurons make adaptations to stress, alter structure, peak, and present with acute or chronic fatigue symptoms. Speaking to their importance, only about 1/4 of our brain is comprised of neurons. Glial cells of differing types make up almost the entire rest of the brain with the purpose of neuronal restoration. As odd as it may seem, having a biological need to sleep 8 consecutive hours is actually advantageous to sport performance and is the time for glial cells to shine. The quality and rate in which learning happens academically and kinesthetically is centered around sleep. Allow yourself to view it as neurons are so solely capable of doing their job, it is actually more efficient to improve their restoration versus increasing quantity. The second reason why we must be stress response organisms is the detriment of health when sedentary nature. If our physiology was focused on receiving a stressor and then responding versus being anticipatory, we would theoretically just adapt to having no metabolic stressors or responsibility, thus maintaining health, caloric needs, and appetite at that state. However, Americans know all too well this is not the case. Our bodies have such a plight for metabolic stress that as little as 150 minutes of low-intensity aerobic exercise per week ameliorates organ-based risk, i.e. the heart, pancreas, liver, etc. Instead, sedentary lifestyle has given birth to issues like type 2 diabetes, liver disease, acute heart failure, and systemic inflammation. Excessively low blood pressure has the highest correlation with mortality, which is developed by a chronic understressing of the cardiac system over time. Ironically enough, the ability to get up off the floor using less than all 4 appendages is correlated strongly against mortality. Simply put, an organism can be lazy to the point its heart can be too weak to deal with daily tasks, and the Turkish get-up might increase life expectancy. Imagination and enjoying the weather are not enough to keep the brain viably healthy either. The human is hardwired to complete puzzles, traverse obstacles, and successfully withstand responsibility. This hardwiring is part of what gives us satisfaction with task completion and ultimately what gives meaning to our daily lives. Without sufficient exercise or need for mental stimulation, we see a drastic decrease in what makes humans human. Neurotropic factors are protein-based hormone-like structures that set the structural scene for learning-based change. These are important enough to be inversely correlated with free radicals and disease, which are known markers of dysregulated biology. This is largely in part to the fact that the prerequisite of neurotropic factor secretion begins with low systemic inflammation and insulin sensitivity. The brain seems to deteriorate if not constantly reforming, remodeling, or overcoming stress. If choosing to think objectively, humans are seen as creatures that need physical stress in order to thrive, as well as a metaphysical aim to equip the mind with motivation to move on. Devoid of religions, destiny, divine right, etc., a human cannot exist without something to do. The mind is an active pioneer with anticipatory biology fit to interact with the variables of the natural world. Amidst this inescapable quest, it is typical to find the human seeking self-confidence and a culture to identify with. Many trainees have awkwardly stumbled into a loving stranglehold with training, which is a fantastic avenue to search for confidence, self-worth, and meaning. As a word, confidence carries an interesting connotation and is a totally separate construct of perception to analyze. At the Performance Vibe, it is common to talk about it as a term that represents awareness and acceptance of self-image. It seems that an integral part of our quest is discovering who we are and being at peace with that discovery. Unveiling chaotic and uplifting aspects of the mind holds equal value in the development of self-image and its modulation over time. A morally righteous individual is aware of their chaos and chooses not to act on it. Challengingly, the construct of first person is not great for self-assessment, so one must also accept that self-image will never chronically be fully aligned with the actual self. This is the plight for social hierarchies, as they give valuable insight onto the individual's place in culture and thus self-worth. Performance Vibe followers like to believe that acute alignment of self-image and development are the driver for great opportunities. Individuals are a product of behavior, biology, and context, which are secondarily driven by desire, emotions, and hormones. Being aware of how these impact thoughts and feelings is vital in the creation of the self-image. Introspection helps to identify which parts of the self-image one chooses to identify with or change. The version of oneself displayed through behavior feeds directly back into confidence. Everyone has order and chaos fighting for spotlight within them. It is impossible to make choices devoid of either or to stick to one extreme. These opposites function on a sliding scale where morals decide connotation and action. The aspect of confidence that comes from within lies here. Moral structures give connotation to the feedback about behavior, and when aligned with the self-image, gives the feeling of confidence to be capitalized on. Culture stands to be an important platform for confidence. Culture is the context or language, if you will, in which individual confidence is applied. By cultural standards, Eddie Hall is an exceptional lifter, and because of the integrity of his word, he is a confident man. However, if he was hired as a crane, not an operator, the actual crane, who had imminent punishment and ridicule if the job was incomplete, despite his strength by our standards, he would not be a confident man. Culture drives context so deep that favorable body composition and perception of colors vary throughout the world. Although heritage and nationality are often concrete, there's immense flexibility in who or what surrounds one's daily life. The cultural feedback received molds the self-image to a great degree. Imagine an instance where someone has been enjoying too many cheat meals recently, despite goals to increase diet compliance and improve aesthetics. Although they may not notice accelerated gaining of fat, if family and friends insist the exact opposite, not only will the likelihood of change drastically decrease, there is now a dangerous separation of self-image from reality. This lack of authentic feedback and support is a major driver in setting an imminent drop-off in confidence over time. The mind's aim is to attain satisfaction through multiple modalities in acute and chronic scenarios. Every task completed has a bioenergetic cost as well as a metaphysical one. There must be satisfaction great enough to subsidize the potential energetic losses of task completion in order to promptly commit to that task. The satisfaction at the end of that task, post-depletion of the motivation and energy, is so inherently tied to human physiology that it can be used as torture. During the Auschwitz camps, prisoners would have to carry heavy sacks several hundred yards on a whim's notice just to put them back exactly where they found it for no reason at all. This utter shattering of the mind's standards and expectations is amongst the most powerful forms of mental torture, causing participants to begin to lose touch with the reality of their behavior. Intense parallels between physiology and the motivation needed to complete a task can be drawn. This is not by coincidence. Establishing confidence, gaining skills, and acquiring responsibility is how the mind finds comfort and placement within culture. Painting a picture where chasing the correct type of satisfaction can not only drive useful adaptations, but peace as well. Heroically, the type of satisfaction someone should be chasing involves facing fear and handling as much stress as possible while still coming out on top. By facing fears, the mind is not only becoming accustomed to behaving favorably with a high heart rate and hormones pumping, but discovers crucial aspects of personality. Through this, one may come to understand that fear was a farce and in which instance confidence is gained. It is ideal to find that fear is realer than anticipated and hopefully an arduous path to traverse. Fear is bred out of the anticipation of pain. Pain is an incredible modulator of behavior and has vast physiology unlike any other emotion. Torture, opiate use, and stubbing one's toe are really all the evidence needed to give pain validity and anecdotal aggregates. It takes responsibility, integrity, skills, logic, and overall stress to overcome something as great as fear. The neurochemical payoff within one's moral code throughout the fear-traversing path is always worth the effort. Time is guaranteed in that its relativity ensures the adaptation to stressors and eventually supports the conquering of them. As the novelty of the obstacle comes and goes, the brain will physically change to be better at battling stress for the ultimate satisfaction payoff, essentially showing that the enduring of stress is the true catalyst to satisfaction. Every story and video game ever made has been premised on overcoming tragic obstacles with positive endings to motivate and expand the mind of participants on overcoming their own obstacles. Clearly, there are certain aspects of the human metaphysical psyche that cannot be stripped without major deleterious issues to deal with. There may not be a defined physiology cascade to follow, but it is very real. Phenomenology is a philosophical study concerning the realist aspects of consciousness, and the philosophers are responsible for determining the realness of pain. Although abstract, this is the exact lens that is necessary when asking athletes to push past their limits. Through training the body, self-development has been a modality for individuation or the lifelong process of finding oneself since early civilization. The realest thing to the individual is what brings them the most satisfaction through specific types of growth. Chapter 2, The Plunge. The organ residing in the bony skull runs the show day to day and leads the mind through a quest. This intricate mosh of glia and neurons leads to miraculous physiology and consciousness, two equally marvelous yet vastly different constructs. The brain is the operator behind neuronal engagement with oneself and the surrounding world. Neurons in the brain make connections with specific downstream ends of muscle tissue to make actions and movement instantaneous. The brain is the home to neuronal adaptation, learning, and the master regulator of hormones. All of the most tangible and quantitative aspects of human physiology are governed or can be traced back to the limbic physical mass known as the brain. The metaphysical mind may lack physical real estate, traceable biomarkers, and biological cascades to investigate. Conversely, Just over 100 years of history, support systems, and the outrageous thoughts spiraling within the mind will argue it may even be realer than the brain. Consciousness, imagination, and ambition are the most uniquely human things on this giant rock, yet lacks location, traceable proteins, and specific terminology to prove its tangibility. However, people are learning to understand perception and continually study behaviors with the hopes of being able to positively modulate the metaphysical mind. Philosophy is amongst the oldest science, giving rise to thinkers who moved away from understanding and defining the metaphysical mind and began to study how to improve ailments in one person's metaphysical realm. Psychology is amongst the youngest sciences. Although it has seen dark times like the lobotomy, it has given tremendous insight on how to mold, alter, and improve behavioral habits. This has led to a tremendous increase in the quality of life for humans across the globe, and with even more opportunities in the future. It is of the utmost importance to the performance-concerned trainee to be fully aware of everything mentioned up until this point. Every single rep completed and failed truthfully will coincide with a specific stress signal that will traverse every single aspect of the physical and metaphysical mind prior to beginning the adaptation process. So many fall in love with the physical possibilities of training because of its seeming endless lack of limitations. This is due to training being an anticipatory construct and having quantitative measures of progress. In the case of actively chasing progress with a training age of more than a few years, the upcoming week of training is already over in a sense. Chasing an outcome that changes the skin suit and the mind involves residual adaptation. It takes an untrained person 72 hours to recover from a single difficult bout of 10 reps on squats, and that is only cut down to 48 hours in a trained individual. Additionally, that is only accounting for local damage. Central fatigue in the brain and spinal cord can take several days to recover from a single bout of emotionally intense effort. The point is, trainees are living in a world where the adding of stressful tasks to a tidal wave of potential adaptation. One set of squats might not need much recovery relative to 5 sets, but it won't induce much change either. Metaphorically, only the most difficult things induce change. Enough residual fatigue can take weeks of restoration prior to reaching a fully adapted and prepared state. This tidal wave builds and builds in the hopes that it sends the change, causing signals desired. Especially when one is deep into multiple consecutive weeks of training, this most current week is just the foremost crest steering the rest of the tide. There is a duality of insignificance and power in the current week and day of training. Increasing performance is far too multifaceted to use blanket statements about its modulation. There are far too many individual worlds that possess an important domain in increasing performance. Every single major organ, including the skin and the blood, in the body has a slightly different type of cellular structure and routine physiology to define it. Now, extrapolate that to how many types of training and methods of progression exist. The possibilities are infinite. Zoom out one step further to the restoration of training stressors, which encompass nutrition and immunophysiology. Painstakingly enough, this only encompasses the physical skin suit and is devoid of limbic-centric practice. The existence of the metaphysical mind alone shouts that there are other avenues to increase human performance. Meditation, sports psychology, and different competitive behavior strategies all exist within their own realm of validity. There are many more worlds, including social and intrapersonal relations, confidence and interpersonal relations, and external environmental interactions with physiology, to name a few. Categorical thoughts are meant to create understanding through the ability to compartmentalize information and limits its efficacy to the boundaries created. Concepts this massive are the place for categorical thinking, just as anti-categorical thinking is ideal for detail-oriented decisions. In reality, all those mini worlds exist on an interactive canvas that ultimately depict a performance. This is the most common structure colleges use to educate American students. Freshmen begin by taking an array of vastly different classes to create boundaries between information. As they progress, they create more and more boundaries within a topic to allow for specific education. Perhaps the most advantageous skill one can possess to enhance learning is the ability to utilize different methods of thinking when analyzing a scenario. This gives birth to the immense amount of possibility within a single target, whatever that target of analysis may be. In its most stripped-down form, training is nothing more than a logical imposition of stress moving the trainee from point A to point B. It may, can, and will encompass many more constructs and require more adjectives as analysis deepens, but it is important to keep the definition in mind. A coach or trainee needs very minimal backing behind progression modalities to validate them due to the bandwidth of worlds encompassing performance. The ambiguity behind the usage of mere logic is valid and often effective because of training's goals of moving a human towards an outcome. Due to science's goal of disproving versus proving, one must go to great lengths to say that a utilized system is ineffective. It is of the utmost importance to dissociate from methods, ideas, and systems clung on to as coaches, while putting emphasis on reminding that task completion is always at the pinnacle of change. Performance vibe coaching subscribes to a concept that the ability of an organism to perform over time is predicated on obstacle traversing and the leading of trainees to overcoming tasks and stressors. Bear in mind that specific stress imposition and adaptation are events that occur in the future. This lens allows coaches to see needs in the clearest light. A training session comes to an end not when the final rep is completed, but when autonomics return close enough to baseline that immune systems can then begin the assessment process. Metabolic waste and damage done during the session will be under the metaphorical microscope as the immune system specifically decides the type of stress that has been imposed, its novelty, and to what degree it is important. The functionality of the immune system is so comprehensive and effective that there is often very minimal need for our intervention, whereas it is excessively common to have generalized gut problems that do require intervention. Coaching prescriptions should be a product of predictions based on post-task biological responses. Although a training session comes to an end, the effects may last for days or weeks and will interact with the residual stress from other training sessions. The half-lives of coaching decisions extend further than often given credit due to the incredible amount of weight placed on prior knowledge of the individual's response curve. The more useful data, regardless of type, that can be brought into a decision, the better. Every scenario revisited will gift a small piece of predictive information that will be useful when inferring what may or may not happen after a task is completed. Communication will always be the limiting factor in a coaching system. Once the coach designs a perfect plan, it must then be transgressed onto a document, interpreted by the athlete, then performed in real time. The opportunity for miscommunication is outrageous, and that it can occur at any point throughout the sharing process. Words and language are nothing more than constructs for understanding. The biggest catalyst for comprehension-based learning is emotional connection, as it imparts the connotation on spoken word. It is commonly seen in young children that friends are more fit to teach skills than school teachers due to a common lacking of necessary relationship with the teacher. The coach-athlete relationship sets a microcosmic cultural context for athlete action. This is the most vital part of successfully reaching a desired outcome. The experiences and interactions that comprise the coach-athlete relationship shape confidence, faith, and volition of the athlete. Compromised relations impact the expectations of both participants through objective decision-making and the ability to solve potential problems. Traversing obstacles and applying problem-solving solutions are the caveats separating a coach from a scientist. Physiological concepts alone cannot drive an athlete to success. If that were true, the athlete with the best heritable genetics would be guaranteed success, but that is certainly not the case. Performance encompasses too short of a span of time for such variables to carry that much importance. Confidence and faith in one's ability to perform come through validation of their efforts. That cannot happen unless they specifically understand what was asked of them and have biologically expended enough effort to feel emotional connection to the event. The coach and athlete alike must start from scratch to develop skills, references, and mutual understanding to be successful. Words only carry value equivalent to the meaning another person holds them in, just like the teacher analogy. What appears on a program and what the coach instructs must resonate with the athlete. It is a phenomenon that words can alter behavior and performance in another human, further proving the efficacy of the coach-athlete relationship. Crucial skills involve conflict management, understanding how to motivate or arouse, and the weighing of decisions. These easily can take up to a year to develop in a typical coach-athlete relationship, depending on the quality and frequency of feedback. The data collection throughout the year adds validity to the acute decisions made. The data itself only gains validity until the end of the second year for the sake of reference. Logically, such an important inter- and intrapersonal performance variable, such as the coach-athlete relationship, takes time to bear the sweetest fruit. Many sports are centered around the premise of a seasonal year, with specific timing for the highest tier of competition. From a preparation perspective, it is essential to then plan 1 to 2 years in advance. The concept of planning such a long period of time of training itself can easily be misleading. It is a fallacy to believe that a pre-made 104-week progression can be followed with compliance. It is impossible to divorce the acute human, detail-oriented demands of coaching, just as it is essential to have enough foresight for decision-making. The long journey of reaching a dream pivots on balancing of all extremes at all times. Assuming the reach is far enough and the level of competition is high enough, it is very unlikely that an athlete's baseline ability to perform will satisfy them. It is not enough to match what has been done in practice. Sports are built on unexpected, phenomenal events ensuing, yet only ever account for brief moments. What makes the word great carry its connotation is its novelty. Greatness is uncommon and attention-grabbing as it spreads to those closest to it. The strife for greatness is what has created coaching as a profession and enlightened the performance equation to be so multivariable. The term peak has a special allure in the performance world. Synonymous with greatness, the term peak brings anticipation, confidence, and hope to all athletes. There are intense behavioral and physiological mechanisms that validate the concept's power. The notion itself has deep parallels to stories and films that inspire us. Whether comedy or tragedy, there is a hero involved who is facing a dilemma. The path the hero traverses exposes the listener to specific characteristics that prove the hero's worth. The best stories involve heroes who have darkness within them and must participate in seemingly immoral actions to reach an ultimately moral end and goal. Not too many tragedies are seen in modern-day films or stories. Throughout, the story the hero must traverse has difficult times where they may risk their lives, work excessively hard, or complete an iconic puzzle prior to finishing the journey. This ties listeners closer to the hero and brings authentic joy as the climax unfolds. Finally, after overcoming fear and accepting chaos, the hero reigns morally righteous as they triumph odds and exude control over the conflicting paradigm. The over-exaggeration of the event is meant to express the battles of morality and inspire us. Evoking emotion in the audience gives underlying lessons and a platform to be shouted from. By sparking emotional cascades, physiology follows suit and suddenly an opportunity for learning arises. Stories are meant to teach us without having to traverse specific pains ourselves. As previously referenced, learning is based on the emotional context information is presented on and the personal displays of that knowledge mixing with culture. The birth of behavioral peaking begins with the premise of the athlete's vision as the hero of their own story. Especially with passionate individuals with great cultural support, it is easy to place oneself in a story-like mindset, creating a rigid view of the outcome. This is an inevitable dual-edged sword athletes carry and recognize with them in order to wield it properly. The human psyche runs far deeper than conscious thought. Intrapersonal interactions resonate beyond brief monologues and, when given the opportunity, quickly bleed into habits and baseline demeanor. Even the driest and most logical athletes still possess imagination and a sliding scale of behaviors they may or may not capitalize on during a competition. The dopaminergic rush is the primary motivator, although it wears a mask of winning, PRs, weight loss, or task completion. It is one's imagination that intermingles with the possible scenarios to motivate, deter, or stop them. These anticipatory scenarios are mostly subconscious, comprised in different variations, giving an athlete a conscious choice on what to identify with in a specific moment. Emotional attachment to the event makes it impossible to participate free of anticipation or vigilance, thus giving further validity to the athlete's psychological health. The building of intensity and anticipation is what dictates what is satisfyingly dopaminergic to us. By going into an event anticipatorily excited, the human is far more likely to find something to give that payoff. In one aspect, this manic peak behavior can be seen as a defense mechanism from the potential lack of satisfaction when reaching the outcome. In another facet, it can be seen as a self-fulfilling streak of novel behavior leading to an event's inevitable success. Beautifully, both perspectives pay respect to the magnitude of getting satisfaction at the end of an arduous chase and recognize that the catalyst is emotional connection. The dark and light sides of the story-like mindset, as previously referenced, are superimposed counterparts, meaning they are mirror images on opposite spectrums of each other. Someone who has the capacity to be scornfully disappointed must also then have the capacity to be relentlessly proud. The intensity of emotion is what creates the extremes of the sliding scale of behavior acted on in competition. These phenomenological aspects of peaking are made so by the physiology flooding each and every biological system. Assuming that there is significant enough emotional connection to the event, the athlete's skin suit makes systemic anticipatory changes to increase preparedness. Referring to these changes as phenomenological is paramount, as they are acute yet vastly potent modulators of behavior based on the synergy between perception, training, and priorities. It is the combination of blood markers, interpersonal behavior, and intrapersonal sensations that make this so real to an athlete. Disregarding how or why the state is achieved, this state should be recognized and treated properly. There are profound changes in the liver, kidney, adrenal, limbic, and hemodynamic function up to 72 hours before a peaked event. Going in deeper, there are changes in neuropeptides, biomarkers, resting heart rate, blood pressure, and heart rate variability, as well as neurotransmitters that further alter the athlete's acute environment. Although likely a self-fulfilling prophecy, regardless if it is the metaphysical that stimulates the physiological or vice versa, what is significant is they happen synergistically and in real time. Anticipatory secretion of catecholamines allows the heart to rise prior to an event, saving our lives, and will always be paired with a sensational emotion. The interconnectedness of the two makes peaking beautiful and allows human biology to have an infinite amount of potential outcomes. Further driving the metaphysical and physiological interconnectedness, peaks can also be specific in the type of physiology stimulated, carrying a behavioral connotation. There is also an individual behavioral response to the type of physiology being peaked. This is a two-way street and a plight for intuition and mindset. For example, a heavily strength-oriented peak will be characterized by more neuromuscular readiness than a high-rep-oriented peak, which will be characterized by metabolism and myology. Both of these peaks have ideal behavior strategies paired with them. The strength peaks typically bring more explosive and rigid movements, whereas the repetition peaks have greater pain tolerance. An individual can then display personal characteristics in relation to these types of physiological peaks. It is not uncommon to see a bandwidth of behavior ranging from extreme aggression to eerily calm. In both extremes, they can lead to a flow state invoking exceptional performance regarding whatever categorical type of peak may be ensued. The cyclic nature of biology is what gives opportunity for the concept of peak to even exist. Their circadian rhythm is an essential cyclic process gone through daily, and when disturbed, peripheral as well as direct issues become quickly apparent and eventually debilitating. It is the appreciation and acceptance of these cyclic laws being applied that allows us to truly understand performance biology. Coaches do not wear lab coats because allostatic intervention demands enough human attention and is not only a different profession, but a different branch of science. Throughout the rest of this book, remember to maintain a phenomenological perspective that what the athlete lives is often realer than the biology and the intervention itself. This is a solution-based phenomenon, not a methodological one. Chapter 3, A New Lens. The nature of boundaries are to serve as useful perimeters that aid in decision-making without the need for excess thought. Confines exist to enhance debatable, tangible choices, as well as erect categorical walls to ward off scenarios that are absolutely not acceptable. This is an efficient way to keep one's decisions indefinitely safe, but is subjected to the rigidity of the nature of the boundaries themselves. For this specific reason, there has been emphasis on human nature, morals, and the usage of a proper lens for decision-making. The greater honesty applied to the moral confines identified, with the less questions of validity must be answered. This allows for greater focus on decisions within the confines themselves, which is where morals serve to be applied in real-life scenarios. There are two analogous governing frameworks in which biology functions. These frameworks act as physiological boundaries for adaptation to function and optimize human existence. Homeostasis is a rigid defense against the changing of key molecular elements. The moral confines of biology answers to survival. Biology is not willing to risk change in markers that can lead to imminent death. This includes pH, sodium, potassium, oxygen, calcium, temperature, and glucose. Drastic changes here will cause enough systemic problems that death will likely and immediately follow. For this reason, we have very little control over these markers regardless of scenario. If humans were left with the responsibility to make decisions regarding these markers, life expectancy would surely be a fraction of what it is today. The composition of this list is simply too encompassing of minute-to-minute physiology for it to be placed in the hands of balance-oriented decision-making. There is very little humans can do to alter these factors and often yields little to no benefit if they are chased. Just as there is a need to have honest faith in selected morals, it is often best to have faith in homeostasis and leave its markers alone. All notions related to increasing health or ameliorating the lack of are innately centered around non-homeostatic mechanisms, further driving a need for us to focus on the modulation of the rest of biology. Imagine a list encompassing everything not included in the homeostatic confines. That would be governed by the framework of allostasis. In essence, allostasis encompasses every minute of our lives, from blood pressure to sex hormones and the daily variations in what seem like chronic, monotonous routines. In both cases, the central premise is to defend a certain level of a ligand, molecular balance, or ionic axis, adhering to the variable's framework based on boundaries. Allostasis allows for emotional context, past experience, plasticity, and external environment to play a role in how or why certain things happen within biology. The concept of inferencing biological favorability of adaptations in an equation that weighs the variability of life itself is absolutely massive to comprehend. It is even more impressive that the human body can execute this decision-making process on its own. This realm weighs potential advantages totally separate from dopaminergic or behavioral decision-making, based on how hormones should be modulated to facilitate change that something within the body sees as advantageous. Framework may be the only adjective accurate enough to describe the allostatic mechanisms, as science has not yet been able to identify the deciding parent. Even the supraclimastic nucleus, governing the circadian rhythm, is subject to allostatic conditions. Understanding the fragility in that responsibility is where the beauty of biology can be found. As devotees to sports performance, it seems too accurate to describe the resemblance of apostles more so than students, in the logic that faith of the mechanisms play out rather than questioning their direct origin. The most profound examples of allostasis in performance biology involve time-centric changes. Performance is entirely centered around short, mindful movements, bringing about physiological prowess and metaphysical arousal to the fruition of sport performance itself. This emphasis on acute nature has already shown the world how peaking must then be possible in any physiological facet. Just how roller coaster tracks build excitement through peaks and valleys, the growth of performance-related variables must cyclically rise and fall in order to have a best opportunity at a given moment. The excess and awe-inspiring power brought by peaking, physiological and metaphysical, is not devoid of cost. Usain Bolt was said to be sore for a week after his last world record. After every PR sensation, there is an analogous moment of fatigue that will follow. Allostatic mechanisms dictate some of the most fascinating aspects of biology. The chronic summoning of these peak opportunities logically brings chronic costs. The hormonal mechanisms backing the peak are acutely wonderful and chronically dangerous. In an obvious plight for self-preservation, biology decreases sensitivity to these cascades while typically increasing the task imposed. This is a major part of the responsibility that a coaches handle when prescribing exercise tasks for increasing performance. The exercise or stressors imposed are not more than a means to communicate with allostatic mechanisms, hoping to elicit specific adaptational orders. These cascades include hormones that increase our heart rate, power output, pain tolerance, perception of time, and motivation. Essentially, a cohort of ligands draws the participant as close to a superhero as imaginable. A truly amazing, acute phenomenon with addictive qualities which can be easily abused by chronic opportunity. The opportunity being presented by the environment also has very different outcomes than the self-induced behavioral opportunities. The acute effect resistance training has on blood pressure is more effective than any specific drug, and it can be confounded, although to a ceiling, for a larger response. The irony lies in that resistance training itself is marked by an increase in blood pressure during the session. Planting our blood pressure on a graph over the course of 3 sets of 10 with 90 seconds rest would show 10 sharp increases and decreases, with the median all falling far above normal. The rest time would ideally show a consistent reading during the middle 75 seconds, with a drop-off and increase at the cessation and onset of the next bout. Over the course of the 3 sets, it would likely show an average increase. It is not until the heart rate, hormones, ventilation, and mind return to their baseline that blood pressure actually returns to normal or more beneficial as well. The reference range for a healthy individual is 120 over 80, yet can be as high or higher than 300 over 180. It is an absolute phenomenon that exposing an organism with abnormal blood pressure to a purposefully more abnormal environment can yield acute benefits. After a single bout of resistance training, we can see amelioration in blood pressure results for up to 48 hours. This effect can compound and offer results that can be easily maintained once acquired. In the scenario of an organism with abnormal blood pressure, exercising every other day, there will be a chronic favorable change in the readings that are separate from the beneficial adaptations of the exercise itself. This notion is studied, its mechanism identified well, and fulfills allostatic requirements. An imposed stressor shows acute changes minute to minute and the residual defending of levels after. Although functioning on a microcosmic level relative to the lifespan, a 60-minute stressor induces changes far greater than its duration. At the very least providing the existence of allostatic mechanisms for the laws of homeostasis, it would not allow for such dysregulation. The homeostatic laws do not explain the favorable changes in blood pressure post-exercise. The laws of homeostasis would demand their maintenance of blood pressure throughout and post-training bouts. Blood pressure is completely mediated by adrenaline-like hormones whose secretion are largely mediated by perception. Many different hormones can express tremendous allostatic behavior over massive spectrums of intervention. Something as peripheral as body fat levels, high or low, can chronically alter specific hormones, and once composition is regulated, hormone panels attempt to return to their respective baseline. Stress and sex-related hormones have the largest room for allostatic variability due to their dual interaction with the mind and external environment. As the human traverses through work, play, cultural socialization, emotional highs and lows, and aging, each scenario is typically accompanied by allostatic changes as well. These phases of life change bring about behavioral emotional responses that are carried along with us. Biology can acutely and chronically make changes in stress and sex hormone levels to match the demands placed on the mind via perception. Only a poor survival organism would have biological systems that do not acclimate to the view of the outside world. Enough protein is needed to defend against the loss of muscle and maintain immune health. When protein malnourishment is endured by the body, it must decide what takes the largest hit, and that is often due to heritable genetics and hormones. Accompanied with a spike in stress-related hormones during malnourishment to subsidize the lack of glucose, the goal is to defend the ill-prepared body from the surrounding world. Testosterone can ameliorate the degradation of muscle by increasing the total amount of protein needed to resynthesize the tissue already required. Testosterone is also inversely correlated with stress hormones being present in the blood. During the Great Depression, there was a striking drop in total food intake for Americans, and that was concentrated mainly in bioavailable protein. It is not a coincidence that there was an average increase of 400 to 500% in adult males compared to today's reference ranges for testosterone. The specific environment that was demanded for survival, and thus the passing decades, have brought about the ubiquity of food and thus given drop, logically, to testosterone today. The levels defended during both times are statistically, biologically, and phenomenologically normal. Again, if testosterone was involved with homeostasis, it would then be impossible to explain this documented occurrence. Sporting events themselves are a plight for the glorious potential of the laws of allostasis and what it can encompass. The Super Bowl is such an immensely popular event that is forever integrated with American culture. Every team in the NFL centers their program around ideally being able to peak at certain points to reach their ultimate goal. Although not every team wins, every team has cycles of intensity throughout the week, month, and season with the intent of being at their most optimal for a certain span of time. For this schedule to successfully pan out, the athletes must actually respond biologically and emotionally to that concept. The millions upon millions funneled through the sport give efficacy to how real peaking may actually be. As far as 72 hours from a competition, allostatic changes can be noted in the liver, kidneys, heart, gut, brain, and generalized cell function. Vitamins and cofactors are used at a greater rate, along with ATP, water, and glucose, and which can be stored more easily and favorably. The type and method in which someone physically stresses their body, combined with the emotional connection to the event, are the driving catalysts for full body change. Measurable heart rate variability actually drops due to the nervous system changes, but functionally acts more favorably. Perception of time and the ability to endure pain are even facilitated. According to blood work, validated testing, and hundreds of years of anecdotes, it is accepted that there is possibility for average biology to be modulated into superhero-like biology for short periods of time. Without allostatic intervention, it would not be possible to strive towards greatness. Chapter 4. The Real House. It takes 20 years of consistent detraining of the circadian rhythm for it to chronically adapt. Without a doubt, it is the slowest and most resistant adaptation our organisms can make. Some of the most miraculous opportunities in our biology that it has to offer are predicated on properly cycling light with excitatory tasks, along with darkness and restorative activity. The structural organization of our brains has glia at the vantage point for neuronal restoration during sleep. With no recognition, glia are responsible for more than 3/4 of the brain's mass and complete their job so well there is no need for a quantitative increase in neurons. During sleep, glia functions so well that it is actually more advantageous to increasingly recover the neurons that we already have than to create new ones. A similar notion exists in myofibril hyperplasia. Upon leaving your home, our suprachiasmatic nucleus picks up on the type of light waves interpreted by the eyes and reflexively stimulates glandin to secrete growth hormone. This growth hormone secretion is different based on the sun or moonlight and is accented with complementary ligands. In response to the photons from the morning sun, growth hormone has an aerobic insulin sensitizing property and is released with cortisol and catecholamines to modulate blood glucose. This logical pairing gives us energy to carry out tasks with focus and vigor. The moonlight's rays stimulate a myotropic growth hormone coupled with melatonin to optimize the restoration of tissue and neurons while promoting deep sleep. In both cases, these growth hormones, of which many isoforms exist, stimulate an endogenous glucose dump with specific fates to ensure that there is opportunity for task completion even in a scenario devoid of food. Ultimately, the circadian rhythm is the most reliable cycle of ligand-induced behavior optimization for an organism that needs sleep and photon-based interaction via light to thrive. The circadian rhythm has proteins that are inherently meant to keep track of time, nutritional chemistry, gene-modulating peptides, and even protein synthesis altering ligands, and these all fall under its umbrella of interactions. Technically, the cycle is never broken. It can be disrupted or over the course of 20 years pushed towards adaptation, but the biological marriage to the need for cyclic light and darkness is unable to be broken. Memory, learning, cognition, glucose levels, digestion, neuromuscular control, perception, and mood are all impacted to some degree by any level of circadian disruption. Our mitochondria have a physiological need for UV light in order to grow, mature, and effectively recycle energy. Without stress, sunlight, and androgens, our mitochondria cannot improve the rate at which they shuttle electrons to produce viable energy. The metaphysical mind needs sleep and direct light exposure to thrive as well. Psychosis or episodic lapse in perception can be derived from sleep deprivation alone or induced rather inhumanely by altering types and timing of light and stress exposure. Our human side pulls the plug on phenomenologically dealing with our major circadian disruption in order for us to hopefully fall back into place through strategically forced sleep, eating, and/or strong feelings of intuition. Serotonin's most basic biological function is to alter behaviors that negatively impact circadian rhythm. Hence, it is a normative reference for depressed individuals. Proper sleep, sunlight, socialization, introspective, and even eating habits ameliorate depressive symptoms to a large degree across all populations by feeding serotonin's mechanisms forward. This lens allows us to classify serotonin allostatically and thus understand its modulatory changes as the organism's life stressors change as well. This notion is validated by the oxytocin dopamine release curve after a traumatic, schedule-altering incident. Typically, these ligands have short-lived expressions. However, immediately after something alters your daily life, they will be defended at higher than normal levels. This oxytocin dopamine release is designed to give us a euphoric motivation to ambitiously drive acute and chronic learning-based change. Serotonin's slow, yet perfectly timed modulatory actions begin after this dopaminergic ligand frenzy normalizes with the purpose of ingraining alterations in behavior, regardless of connotation. Of course, such a vastly important cycle needs a regulatory system to defend potential issues on the micro level so every deviation is not a major threat. Protein synthesis is our greatest example of this phenomenon. It is impossible to have a near-perfect ability to link opposing strands of amino acids, birthing defense systems to manage our faulty creations. Such an ingenious mechanism is advantageous over increasing an already relatively good percentage of success, so more focus can be placed on modulation rate via ligand interaction versus changing intangible perfection. The circadian rhythm's sidekick role is filled by the autonomic nervous system. This portion of our nervous system is responsible for maintaining a chronically homeostatic, acutely allostatic baseline and flipping the stressor intervention switch. The variable players within the autonomic nervous system are subservient to an excitatory or an inhibitory branch that sets forth behavior-impacting hormones with the power to optimize any scenario we encounter. With the circadian ability to regulate time-centric phenomena, it is only logical to have an acute bell-ringing system. Without the autonomic nervous system, every deviation from normal would have an opportunity to actually push vital physiology out of range. Imagine a world where there is no anticipatory rise in heart rate prior to a major lift or a decrease in stress response at its cessation. The autonomic nervous system is largely responsible for important shifts in biology throughout an atypical or typical day. The vagus nerve extends from the center of our skulls down through our diaphragm into the top of our gut. Running like a plumb line through the most important sector of our anatomy, its branches impact the heart, lungs, and brain. It is the primary governor of autonomic cascades, asserting its discretion by increasing or decreasing tone. The more tone asserted, the more parasympathetic actions occur. Releasing of vagal tone allows the sympathetic branch to intervene. The sympathetic nervous system uses potent cohorts of ligands to leap out of the relaxed baseline state with precisely enough power to combat the task at hand and is typically exceptional at hitting its mark. The price tag on such a system is high and forces reliance on the ability of the parasympathetic branch to effectively resynthesize ATP with minimal cost. The biological tax imposed by having the ability is unavoidable due to humans' relatively high baseline nutritional needs for health compared to other mammals. Beyond the baseline amount of biological tax imposed, each bill inherited by responding to stress must be paid in some manner, regardless of how it is completed. The extent to which the human body expresses a restorative baseline further expresses the effectiveness and cost of the sympathetic nervous system's ability to vigilantly monitor minute-to-minute stressors while the circadian rhythm seamlessly modulates chronic spans of time, like seasonal changes, for example. Through a biological lens, it may seem like the human is much more of a primitive beast being contained by a proper social being. However, the vagus nerve has become socially smart over human development into cultural beings. Autonomic responses are inherently interwound with a metaphysical perception and emotional context, which are firmly molded by cultural norms, expectations, and experiences. A parasympathetic baseline day to day seems to not only benefit our biology, but the ability to successfully thrive as an organism in a cultural group. Positive human interaction brings feelings of safety and calmness while ameliorating depressive symptoms. All mammalian cultures seem to place positive connotation on behavior regarding safe, social, and community-oriented strategies. There is exceptional physiology behind an authentic hug that drives autonomics instantly towards a parasympathetic state. Conversely, negative social interactions bring about emotional distress along with immediate sympathetically driven defensive-like behavior and are often accompanied by a delayed sympathetic response as well. Even the gut, heart, lungs, and behavioral choices are subjected to autonomic hormones and vice versa. Regardless if increased cardiac output prior to exercise increases motivation, or the motivation to train stimulates anticipatory cardiac output changes, it phenomenologically happens and both sides of the coin have biological validity. In the realm of mammalian interactions, ATP is the paramount chemical compound in which things are centered. Every item on the homeostatic control list can be traced directly back to ATP to AMP ratios. As if there is a minute-to-minute currency balance that subscribes to allostatic laws, biology monitors the ratios and appropriateness of ready-to-use energy to recently used-up energy through motivational-based behavior mechanisms. Autonomics and the circadian rhythm are system-wide acute and chronic modulators of ATP to AMP ratios. Autonomics are premised on a release or contain phenomenon to favor biological safety. The ATP to AMP ratio and circadian rhythm function on such a consistent balance it is more similar to a constant recycling of the same processes, light and dark in the case of the circadian, and destruction to restoration in the case of ATP and AMP. Adaptations made in sport via capacity, hypertrophy, or strength are sympathetically mediated tools to deal with the recycling of energy relative to specific stressors chronically dealt with. Although all adaptations deal with these energetic ratios, each adaptation has specific avenues in which energy is resynthesized and broken down. Life would be at extreme disadvantage if there were not multiple avenues in which to restore energetic debts. Out of the thousands of different validated biological uses for ATP, there are far fewer methods in which to restore it. Much like actual currency, there are many items in which we can substantiate expenditure, but do not have nearly as many individual sources of income. Novel methods of replenishing glucose and energy brings awareness to the idea that often things swing on a pendulum, not a switch-flipping phenomenon. The same notion applies to the methods in which ATP is recycled and broken down. These are predicated on oxygen availability, intensity, emotional and physical, and the duration of response time. Of the three systems this chapter will briefly cover, remember that there is no absolute dominance. The activity of each system is beautifully blended together as they never cease cycling, traversing time, autonomics, and are blind to the bias of destruction or restoration. The ideal baseline state associated with feelings of comfort, low resting heart rate, stable oxygen presence, and shuttling of blood to the gut while using free fatty acids to pay off energetic debts. Beta oxidation is the term for the energetic avenue used to divorce key electrons from free fatty acids and to modulate these products into usable ATP. Although a slower mechanism, beta oxidation has a higher ultimate yield of ATP per molecule with less waste versus its carbohydrate-centered counterpart. Logically, this process fits the need for the parasympathetic nervous system's placement in our daily life. The ability to effectively go through beta oxidation in a relaxed baseline state is perhaps the most crucial prerequisite for health solely because of the amount of time spent under potential dysregulation. With enough specific adaptation of this system through training and nutritional fates, it acts as a potent agonist of ATP during stressful times. In the performance world, this means that as you resistance train, the available oxygen in the blood can favorably assist beta oxidation in restoring ATP debts in the background, mainly in between sets of a training session. Aside from specific training scenarios, beta oxidation is typically not the primary avenue of ATP restoration amidst training, as it is a sympathetically mediated task. With enough of an aerobic training base, adaptations can be made that allow the mitochondria, or the organelle or worker of beta oxidation, to increase its bandwidth, as well as speed and at rate at which scenarios can be done in each specific job. A sympathetic nervous system that functions instantaneously via hormone interventions would logically need a replenishment system with seemingly instant return, systemic usage, and ubiquitous substrate. The biological regulators of glucose function are impeccably tailored to fit our sympathetic nervous system. The intricate homeostatic and allostatic management of our blood glucose is the first events for this beautiful coupling. Acutely, blood glucose absolutely favors and follows all allostatic laws within the time frame of minutes to even a few years depending on the scenario. However, this is a statistically insignificant portion of the human lifespan. When extrapolated over the course of decades, an individual difference is accounted for, blood glucose levels are in actuality homeostatically controlled. This duality explains for allostatic alteration in glucose curves seen based on lifestyle, specific stressors, and environment. It further seeks to determine that there is a smaller degree within each organism's personal responses that vary over a long period of time to the same types of stressors. Although unbelievably simple, the chemical composition of glucose is actually highly combustible in the proper setting. In the biological world, almost anything can be catalyzed down to usable glucose, even the glycerol backbone of a free fatty acid. This is a plight for the importance of the sympathetic intervention as the main tool for combating potential stressors. As human nature is predicated on anticipatory responses, mediated by logical autonomic framework, it demands two energetic tactics to replenish ATP stores. Beta oxidation is the preferred, low-cost replenishment avenue to trot down during non-stressful times for its lack of waste and additional health perks of dietary fat consumption. When life gets chaotic and demands a potent response, there cannot be conscious effort put into waste management or peripheral perks. The only goal is then to survive the task. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose for ATP. This energetic system cannot be avoided in any exercise modality, regardless of individual training history, and can function with or without the presence of oxygen. These ligands secreted by the sympathetic nervous system allow for utilization and liberation of glucose at a much higher rate relative to normal function. This is a crucial aid in the glycolytic response to stress as it primes both sides of the physiological coin prior to diving into combating a task. Anticipatory changes in heart rate, behavior, and perspiration in the potential case of a threat, even if nothing needs to be done, is largely mediated by these glycolytically related sympathetic actions. Glycolytic action as a whole is centered on the task being stressful, and its immediate response exists on a sliding scale of duration, intensity, and momentary substrate availability. The non-oxygen-centric replenishment of ATP cannot be sustained very long, give or take 60 seconds, but has incredible potential for power output, and its training effects are quite impressive. Within the non-oxidative glycolytic world, training adaptations that can be chased include various types of hypertrophy, glucose and glycogen metabolism modulation, cardiac output, and body composition changes. These effects are largely mediated by how stressful the replenishment of ATP without oxygen can be, as well as the metaphysical, cellular, and substrate taxes imposed. Lactate is an essential metabolite of action as it helps ameliorate hydrogen-based waste and can be used as an acute energy source by the heart or brain. Although it is beneficial in sustaining non-oxidative glycolysis, its buildup is a marker that glycolytic stress imposed is greater than the ability to deal with it and will ultimately aid in bringing the task combating ability to a close. When the task's demands are persistently stressful while lacking extreme intensity and extend to beyond 1 or 2 minutes, oxygen must then be involved to some degree in this glycolytic process. This concept is based on the fact that the maintenance of intensity response cannot be sustained, or the power production of non-oxidative glycolysis cannot go on any longer. Increased duration of stress in the oxidative portion of glycolysis forces changes in lactate to favor ATP resynthesization over the production of power. Both glycolytic ends yield the same amount of ATP, but have slightly different costs, adaptations, and ideal stressors to respond to. Oxidative glycolysis summons pyruvate as its aid during the energetic recycling process. Pyruvate has dual fates to account for because of its spectrum of intensity and the duration of glycolysis that can be yielded. It can be broken down to lactate and deal with non-oxidative replenishment, where intensity and power impose the energetic bill. Pyruvate can also undergo an electron modulation and replenish ATP through a beta oxidation-like mechanism. Ultimately, a lack of fuel, volition, or ability to sustain replenishment of oxygen slowly dissipates and will end the bout of exercise. The phosphagen system is miraculous in aspects that extend beyond its ability to cycle ATP. Behavior, external environment, drugs, and the sympathetic nervous system have more ability to alter outcomes here than any other cascade of ATP replenishment. Glycolysis and beta oxidation are largely predicated on ameliorating threats or the inhibition of exercise, performance, and deviations from the homeostatic environment. As long as these two systems have substrate, which isn't overly difficult, they can ameliorate threats, and exercise performance can be prolonged substantially. Due to these predicating principles, once an unsustainable threshold of stress has been crossed, i.e. true failure, there is an immense cost to the system, and any ability to reduce or reproduce the process is temporarily thwarted. The phosphagen system, however, exists on a strict as-needed basis for action, holding the most potential for incredible feats of performance, as well as the ability to intervene on beta oxidation or glycolytic functions at any singular moment in time. It is impossible to truly appreciate the speed at which the mechanistic breakdown and recycling of ATP happens in the phosphogenic realm. Assuming the incoming stressor invokes enough sympathetic and ionic activity, ATP will be hydrolyzed at rates equivalent to the needs using immense assistance from the brain. When contractions are plentiful via glycolysis and beta oxidation, there is a cyclic recycling of waste products into usable parts, thus decreasing the need for the time-sensitive secretion of sympathetic hormones. In the phosphagen world, where everything is time-centric, the contractions must rapidly ensue with adequate force, or the potential for risk rapidly increases. The brain's interaction with the phosphagen system is mediated mainly by vigilant behavior. Invoking this behavior strategy increases the assessment of potential stressors that are needed for a response, thus sparking sympathetic ligands to increase metabolic function. Creatine is the most immediate phosphogenic recycler of ATP, giving it a myriad of important roles. It is called for restorative action from the initial stress response to near 20 seconds and can be restored while other systems, glycolysis and beta oxidation, are in use. Creatine aids in neurological action as well as the storage of glycogen. The multifunctional actions of creatine show the interconnectedness of all energy systems and the phosphagen system's ability to intervene at any given time. The time-centric neurobehavioral and energetic relationships the phosphagen system has seemingly given it the ability to increase potential for capacity as well as power, assuming it is needed. The greatest stories and images of traversing immense obstacles are attached to the concept of being uncomfortably close to empty, and against all odds, summoning a final dopaminergic thrust, allowing righteousness to prevail. The phosphagen system is an inevitable toll to pay when sparking other energetic cascades and can intervene with potent actions at any moment. The most impressive human markers of performance exist in the phosphogenic realm, regardless of sports selection. From peak force to peak cognition, the creatine-focused recycling of energy and heightened sympathetic activity to accompany it allow for incredible showcasings of biology. Beyond a trainable performance marker, the phosphagen and autonomic axis is the very relationship that makes us successful stress response organisms in a highly variable world. Chapter 5. Strapping in. Until this point, everything addressed is merely entertainment to the performance enthusiast. The previously presented information uses a performance vibe lens on basic performance sciences and exercise physiology. Information presented from this point forward will assume the usage of that lens and speak on an application-based platform. The following application-based material is predicated on the synergistic melding of biology, coaching experience, and in-the-trenches anecdotal inferences. The energetic and motivational costs of training and performing are the forefront of adaptational change. The first step in changing is being able to recover from stress. Androgynous organisms, devoid of gender-defining hormones, can still build muscle tissue, respond to training stimuli positively, as long as they are nourished, motivated, and not sleep-deprived. It is also known that males or females having a normal sex hormone profile can cease to make training adaptations due to excess stress, sleep deprivation, and malnourishment. As previously stated, ligands are catalysts that streamline processes but are not the sole drivers. It is human biological nature to respond to stressors in order to sustain survival. Prior to understanding performance vibe methodology, the participant must have a sound ability to dissociate and question. Calories are a wonderful fitness-related example of something that is culturally and almost completely phenomenologically real, although their actual existence is questionable. In this exact manner that colors add radiate energy and distinction to life, they are merely vibrations of light which the eyes interpret as color. In the same manner that colors and calories exist merely phenomenologically due to cultural norms, science is only real to the science enthusiast. For more information on why I think calories may not exist, Check out Beast Fitness Radio, Talks with Alex and Andy, and we have an entire 2 hour or so episode on the very topic. The confines of performance are weighted primarily on the coach-athlete relationship, and this is increasingly so as the athlete traverses the hierarchy of success. The effectiveness of communication and clarity of role expectations are the two drivers of success in the coach-athlete relationship. The reason these confines fall into social and metaphysical hands is due to the seeming lack of biological limitations. Two confounding examples driving this theory are the practical confines of VO2 max and the seemingly infinite ability to resynthesize ATP. It has been noted through research that the most elite aerobic athletes seem to have very small differences in their VO2 maxes. This paradigm exists to some degree in any level of eliteness, but particularly small differences are noted in the top tier of the aerobically trained. If amongst the most important performance variables for aerobic sports sees a halt in progression, then it forfeits some importance once the criterion marker is achieved. As a reminder in chemistry, constructs like absolutes and ubiquity do not exist and allow for the greater purpose of infinite possibilities. Understanding that premise, ATP availability is the closest marker to ubiquity that human biology has to offer, something that should truly be marveled at by the performance enthusiast. The price of being anticipatory creatures is that there is a constant fluxing of energy, meaning there is never a sole moment of restoration or breakdown, and is blind to systemic real estate. Some areas can be in restoration, while others exist in a breakdown state. The concept of real estate not being married to biochemical actions conceptually explains the ability to build contractile tissue and shrink adipocytes, or recomp as the meatheads of the world may know it. Attaining such a favorable outcome does not require more effort per se, it requires more specific signals to be sent. There must be biochemical synergy between restoration, degradation, stress type, in order to accurately achieve a desired outcome. Performance is the momentary expression of biology and the metaphysical self. The immense human variability that encompasses the equation of performance leads us to realize there are many different avenues leading towards a successful outcome. The two confounding examples analyzed have been major factors in molding performance vibe application methods. The ability to go from a completely zoomed out objective lens to a very phenomenologically anti-categorical one on the same exact topic is crucial in making any training decision. Each training decision carries weight as it is a contribution of the sum of biological signals to be sent. Although there is generally a limit on the amount of energy, stress, work, and stimulation that can be handled as a whole, biology is typically exceptional at weighing and recognizing each individual stressor. In Chapter 2, the tidal wave of stress is referenced to depict the summation of stressors and how it leads into a peak. What allows peaks to have specific outcomes is the moldability of this stress tidal wave. The degradation and restoration the athlete is submitted to is subjected to the laws of interference. This fundamental law of adaptation begins with the understanding that nothing is instant. The training task completed yesterday will not see a recovery for multiple days. Throughout this multi-day process, there are elements of the recovery process that should be facilitated, like nutrition and metabolism-based damage, or glycogen and free fatty acid flux, and elements that should ideally be left alone, transcription factors, AMPK timing, and the immune response. The law of interference gains validity through the latter's effects. For example, AMPK is absolutely a beneficial biological cascade to attack and explore during training as related to the benefits of energy and nitrogen breakdown. However, AMPK modulation may be contraindicated during certain periods as it can alter the end fates of substrates. It can be ideal for liver glycogen to be low as compared to muscle glycogen, or vice versa. Philosophy and morals aim to ensure major mistakes and impediments in decision making are ameliorated by creating advantageous confines. This concept is predicated on the accuracy of one's coaching morals and how closely they are adhered to. The sought-after benefit of proper philosophical confines are the increases in efficiency and the ability to focus on anti-categorical matters. The moral platforms in which training decisions are made are similar to a trusted guide. Trust brings faith in the moral confines, thus decreasing questioning of the decision-making process as well as opening the floodgates to detail-oriented input along the way. Two of the most central TPV programming morals are that of behavioral trainability and environmental priority over the criterion amount of work needed for adaptation. The concept of behavioral trainability is deep-rooted in the neurology of learning, something that is very quantifiable. A disparity begins between the metaphysical self and neurology when the athlete is forced to pick an optimal behavior strategy to train by answering the question of why. This is the most powerful plight for optimal versus suboptimal decision-making in sport and actually decreases the validity of reaction time. Deviating even further from the quantifiable when creating training prescriptions and biological environments is due to specific alterations in human behavior. The process always begins with authentic listening and empathy as they add to biology's most difficult questions. There must be a dynamic understanding of the athlete's personality, morals, goals, inhibitions, facilitators, and the stress capacity management. Prior to selecting optimal behavior strategies, it is imperative to see the organism select a disadvantageous one in the desired skill. Prior to making a single recommendation or tangible assessment, enough information can be gathered through observation alone to infer on the weakest and strongest potential traits and why certain patterns may have been selected in that environment. Behavioral training becomes an accent to any program by using quantifiable prescriptions to mimic the biological scenarios which causes panic when selecting variables like rest, volume, load, effort, and frequency. These resonate with an individual and thus cause their specific behavioral response. There are very real biological markers that correlate with behavior making, as it is a tangible adaptation to chase. Training prescriptions directly impact how someone behaves in regards to a specific performance-related scenario. The arguments over nuance and variables in the performance hierarchy will never end, nor should they. The nature of debates themselves show progressive thinking, which must be defended in order to be considered valid. This lens does not apply in any scenario when it comes to performance-centered coaching. There is no best method, only what is best for the athlete in a specific moment. With respect to second and third order actions, the only goal of a coach should be to take an organism from point A to point B. The conceptual construct previously stated about moral confines allowing greater focus on details was actually derived from the second central concept of performance-bound methodology. The validity of this concept is premised on a threshold of generalized stress or damage that must be imposed on an organism for it to adapt. This is extremely logical and agreed upon by the most obtuse coaching minds. The threshold of stress must be crossed is specific for each organism based on where they are in life, past experiences, the type of adaptation sought after, like glycolytic, neurological, creatine, tissue remodeling, or cross-sectional area changes. A well-defined threshold and where the organism's stress levels fall relative to it are paramount in each training decision made when chronically chasing adaptation, which should be most of the calendar year. It is then recommended to stay near or slightly above this threshold as it optimizes the total amount of adaptation that can be made. Targeting something specific for optimal return versus the kitchen sink approach is a wonderful analogy to understand when looking at this concept. The performance vibe difference begins to come into play once an organism has met the stress requirements for adaptation. To be clear, this threshold is not maximum recoverable volume or anywhere near it. The threshold is simply the minimum amount of damage needed to spark specific biological cascades that will mold the skin suit's ability to respond. Proposing that once it is traversed, it is the environment in which the stress is presented that is the greater adaptation driver versus furthering the amount of stress imposed itself. If the goal is to increase cross-sectional area or total muscle size, then spending time in a hypoxic, nourishment-depriving environment that depletes glycogen will yield more specific results than completing greater amounts of tonnage or total work targeting the myofibrils in that area. Contextually, if someone was chasing larger biceps, once the threshold of amount of damage has been crossed in that area, they would get more results from a proper work-to-rest ratio, effort-predicated set via one exercise than adding a second exercise with uncontrolled rest, which would thus increase the total amount of tonnage or work that's possible. The final concept of this chapter is flux as it pertains to training. Under normal conditions, there is a range of how much something is allowed to flow in and out. Applying allostatic laws and specific stressors that can range must be pushed bilaterally. With proper training and nutritional synergy, this concept can be manipulated to facilitate biological goal attainment. In order to express the flux phenomenon on key energetic compounds, glycogen and creatine are most common in performance, training decisions should be viewed as directional signals for the biology chased. The simplest example to follow in order to fully understand this concept is that of glycogen, water, and cross-sectional area. Glycogen is the largest molecule stored in a muscle cell and under normal conditions brings 2 molecules of water with it. When someone has trained a muscle group in a fashion that depletes it of glycogen, it will be more sensitive to the reuptake of glycogen via the laws of allostasis. Among other examples, this is validated by the ability of calcium ions to grant glucose passage into muscle cells without a transport protein. A muscle cell that has recently underwent hypoxic damage from glycolytic training will therefore more likely be able to store glucose as glycogen than a muscle cell in a normal environment. The training stressor can become potent enough that through frequency, there can be anticipatory changes in local hemodynamics and behavior when certain routines begin. Food and sleep can also undergo anticipatory changes in enzymes, appetite, energy, and even hormone secretion. When an organism has been chronically trained to make this anticipatory response, there can be a hyper-storage and depletion ability, essentially bypassing the biological safety parameters put in place to keep the normal ranges intact. This example has become iconic through weight class sports. After a few bottles of water, salted white rice, and enough time, an athlete can go from an awful to normal to superhuman state. After the competitive bout has ended, the same athlete returns to their normal state. Peaking can be acutely facilitated via the flux phenomenon greatly. However, its ability to be chronically active is in fact the main physiological driver of adaptations made over time. Chapter 6, Adjusted Goggles. What makes performance-centric coaching a puzzle, not an input-output equation, is the distance from being dose-dependent. The concept of being dose-dependent, in the contextual sense, implies that the more X is applied, the more yield we will see from X. The paradigm of drugs in sports is a prime example, as the athlete using excess supplementation does not see an exuberant change compared to the athlete using a low to moderate dose. The paradigm of work and training also brings this to light in that there is varying return on what is prescribed. Not only is the work done in training subjected to transfer, which is the ability to actually improve what is intended, but an optimal window of damage exists. Too much or too little can be bad. If the performance world was that of a dose-dependent mechanism, the answer would simply be more drugs and work. This is thankfully not the case, and what adds such excitement to sports. The lack of input-output predictability is what gives performance coaching in sport such an infinite variable to undergo. If the Super Bowl was predicated on money spent to win, who would watch it? If heritable genetics were the biggest factor in individual sports, who would actually compete? Playing the puzzle game of performance requires a biological and metaphysical lens to counterbalance each other. In every scenario, both must be accounted for, but they may carry different weights. This is entirely predicated on the individual's effort-reward system and in regards to the task completed or what is asked of them. Some athletes can handle tremendous monotony with a low cost of compliance and vice versa. This is most noted when people who diet to lose weight. Some find a need for highly dopaminergic foods in order for compliance, and others find solace in the lack of. As always, this is why effort put into the coach-athlete relationship has the highest return on investment. As ambiguity of successful event avenues expands and the performance puzzle becomes more exciting, parameters become increasingly important. It is paramount to define the potential detriments of pushing too far. Hypervigilance and hyposatisfaction are the root causes of decreased ability to make optimal progress towards a performance-centered goal. Hypervigilance is characterized by excessive waste of cognitive and biological energy on the potential for risk assessment. Primarily impacting biology and then cascading to behavior, is associated with atypical anxiety and paranoia with glucocorticoids, lethargy and libido issues with adenosine problems, and or memory and balance issues associated with neurology. Hyposatisfaction is characterized by lacking neurochemical rewards for task completion. Although there is a less defined biological impact, the behavioral manifestations are far more deleterious than hypervigilance. Being undersatisfied brings about potent social and intrapersonal issues that can have lasting impacts on motivation or perception. These are all manifested based on the individual's perception, the types of stress, and their placement in the cycle of life. Both of these root causes are manifested by a continuing lack of behavioral flexibility. Heightened discipline and rigidity in behavior can have benefits during acute bouts of time. However, the ability to adapt to change in a low-cost manner is the longest-term driver of adaptation as well as health. Athletes who have major behavioral dysregulations outside of competition and in daily life, when they perceive change, are entirely hyper-rigid and typically lack length in their athletic careers. This term has biological and behavioral manifestations that make it a danger to athletes' progress. Every organism has an absolute limit of stressors they can respond to, whether it is appropriate or not, prior to their drastic breakdown. Each task and responsibility subscribed to weighs in on their gross limit. As the limit becomes closer, specific systems choose rigid behaviors to ensure tasks get completed, but at a major cost. The chronic innervation of the sympathetic nervous system is amongst the most deleterious to encounter, as it brings ventilatory, digestive, arousal and motivational, nutritional, and hormonal issues. But that is just one facet to look at in the case of hyperrigidity. The perils of rigidity on performance can also negatively impact the adrenals, which is known as classic overtraining, the substantia nigra, or the home to dopamine, the pancreas, or the home to insulin, liver, kidney, cardiac, and social systems as a whole. The typical paradigm is these systems have an inability to flux and find a chronic threat countering as via the allostatic state as their new baseline versus a restorative baseline. Having foresight in identifying this paradigm allows dissociation from the potential ceilings on performance, i.e. calories, the laws of periodization, etc., and puts real-time adaptation at the forefront, which allows for more biological flexibility and adaptation potentials. There must be constant respect for the perimeter of effort biology erects around an organism. It is integral to understand that this perimeter is individual to the person, molds over time, and is impacted differently as variables phase in and out of life. The original plight for the coach-athlete relationship is to identify the acute state of these parameters per the athlete individually so that performance prescriptions can be made authentically and as much stress can be handled as possible. Training decisions should drive the performance organism towards an imaginary best as well as satisfy a quantifiable priority list. Encompassing such opposing extremes is paramount in protecting the athlete's confidence and ensuring precious effort is not wasted. The imaginary vision created is based on human qualities related to behavior and stress response, often referred to as the type of person who is capable of completing the task. The priority list is predicated on physiological traits that will accent the organism's toolkit and match the behavioral traits being pursued. Neurology and creatine adaptations are logically paired with aggression, and glycolysis is logically paired with grit. Inviting an athlete to pursue these two ensures an infinite timeline to goal attainment and ameliorates the stressors imposed by time, compliance, or outside life events. An athlete's focus should be put on acute task completion and quality of life. A coach should place focus on task modulation, interpreting feedback, and protecting the effort satisfaction curve of the individual. Peaks are mainly enzymatic, behavioral-centric training systems that use metaphysical behavior changes as a main driver. Early accumulation of these qualities in training are specifically focused on residual stressors that drive neurological as well as myotropic change. Once the metaphysical organism and quantifiable priority list are identified, the opportunity to shape the road the coach-athlete relationship will follow is ready to be taken. An interesting nuance in performance vibe methodology is that all programs have two phases: an individually tentative outline and the specific parameters followed in real time. The tentative outline is fully comprised prior to any prescription or recommendation being made and acts as a guide for the actual program composed for the athlete to follow week to week. The outline is logically reverse engineered, beginning with the restoration after a peak and ending with the first task. Great emphasis is placed on the imaginary organism and quantified priority list so that the reverse engineering process is accurate. The disparity between the intent of the task, what the athlete completes, and the stress imposed is the first line of validity to reverse engineering the guide for the coach to follow, not the athlete. Secondly, there is a major lack in the ability to control outside life variables impacting the performance organism and the alterations that must be made to the program. This is inevitable, and the ability to have foresight on important training events via the reverse engineered outline in conjunction with proper feedback are what allow for optimal adjustments to be made for the athlete's program in real time. Overarchingly, the best athlete is the one who is happy with their current state, motivated to improve, and has a multitude of variable opportunities to take advantage of over time. Just as the actual implementation of training tasks, adaptation, and everything asked of the athlete is a beautifully layered process that does not begin on day one or fully cease to happen on the final day of training. Assuming there is room to take a step, there is a chance to create something new. The specific laws mentioned thus far have been to spark the notion that all these processes are cyclic and very rarely linearly finite. There is always potential to impose stress and alter how one adapts over a period of time. The variable making of training plans anywhere on the complexity spectrum can be effective due to human biology responding, not necessarily the plan or program itself. Chapter 7, Design and Structure 101. Appreciating nuance, layering, and that small differences manifest over time is paramount in creating performance vibe-inspired protocols via a reverse-engineered outline. This appreciation drives efficacy for the priority list, imagined end organism, and coach-athlete relations, as well as proper feedback systems. Modulation of exercise prescriptions and dealing with variables impacting the training process in real time lean on the integrity of everything done prior to the original recommendations. A very different set of glasses must be worn when assessing the training phase, week, and day. As briefly mentioned during the reverse engineering process in the prior chapter, it has been seen that a successful layering of training is what leads to positive long-term change. This is most easily seen in linear periodization, where increasing the amount of work done per week or session can thus improve the ability to perform the same task the next time. These changes can be facilitated by as little as a 1% increase in load, increase applied force, or even decrease damage from the same task. However, this cannot be accomplished by a singular session. The imposition of similar training tasks over time, causing residual fatigue, is the driving need for adaptation. Rigid blocks of training are to the priority list, as phases are to the imagined ideal organism. The phases are masterfully blended over time with detail emphasis and analogously run with priority-driven blocks. Phases encompass small biological nuances like where you are in the spectrum of glycolysis, the velocity pairings, and the amount of hypoxia imposed, and the athlete's behavior strategies used to complete this task. Blocks of training have specific parameters of function that need large chunks of time to conquer, including goals like increasing neurology, skills or learning, cross-sectional area, or cellular function as a whole. Blocks are purposefully blind to the caveats of phases, which again mirror the concept of priority list and the imagined organism. Phases are where science and metaphysics mold to the athlete specifically, allowing for retrospective magic to happen. Blocks acts as the moral confine to keep individual phases of training accurate in their individual block recommendations. The extreme emphasis placed on the perils of rigidity, feedback, and the vision used to create the program were to ensure proper understanding of these concepts. The purposeful choosing to neglect terms previously accepted, like micro, meso, and macro cycles, are because they are entirely predicated on a singular variable, time. Training concepts and language should be predicated on athlete progress and their ability to change. Research may show that it takes X amount of time via work to make X change, but it is blind to the prescription itself, the intent of its performance, potential for interference, and past experience. Adaptation is far too individually specific to rest one's head on completely in research. Yet, it has enough paradigmic validity that complete intuition will not yield optimal results either. The most obvious example has to do with glycogen depleting and loading in athletes via training and nutritional perspectives. During a fasted period, there are massive differences in the substrates or carbs and fats used based on oxygen, vigilance, past, present, and anticipatory activity, hormones, and even age. During a glycolytic training activity, the experience, emotional connection, and sensitivity to norepinephrine are drastic modulators of how much and where liberated glucose will be pulled from to sustain activity. Phenomenologically, this notion of individual difference is driven even further in the amount of carbohydrate intake an organism needs to pay the costs of activity and to fill glycogen stores. In a microcosmic fashion, the training week and training day follow a similar concept to phases and blocks. The training week is the quantitative layer of stress being billed to the athlete's adaptational bank account. Each week will have an overarching cost and specific compositional cost that should be layered in a progressive manner over time. Although each training day has its own specific goals, logically days make up weeks, they're designed to match athlete needs, abilities, and behavior. For example, even the same glycolytic training day with the same volumetric and stress goal can be programmed differently based on behavior strategies that athlete may choose when met with hypoxia and a high heart rate. In both cases, the biological cost of that training is eerily similar, but the behavioral challenge, or potential lack thereof, will impact the effort satisfaction bills very differently. Asking someone to step out of their comfort zone costs more and accents the biology differently than a task where someone is overly confident. The training day, phase, and imagined organism all fall into a metaphysical and intuitive perspective with emphasis on coach-athlete relations as well as feedback for success to be prominent. Training weeks, blocks, and the priority list encompass specific traits that can be defended biologically with emphasis on a factual brain for success. It is impossible to divorce these two extremes from each other or their individual roles in performance. It is in support of these extremes that such a duality must exist and is what the driving concept behind performance vibe methodology is. There are far too many scenarios where there is a criterion amount of biology that must be met, but with an infinite amount of avenues that can be taken to get there. This common paradigm creates an access of metaphysical reasoning to make a choice and the proper pushing of biology to drive change. Both of these exist while avoiding the perils of rigidity. Overarchingly, the access should reside near an imaginary midline, only making slight shifts towards one end when warranted for progress or the amelioration of major inhibitions. More importantly, it is the recognition of this axis that truly births the notion of peaking and allows for the potential of drastic organism change. Using the information from the outline and the priority list process in conjunction with feedback in real time is what allows tight control over this imaginary axis. For example, if someone has yet to meet their glycolytic hamstring needs for the week, but due to a previous session are too sore to complete the intensification protocol as intended, their weekly needs can then be easily met by a shorter rest, higher volume task because of the environment. In this example, the athlete's effort satisfaction curve is maximized, the adaptation needs are met, and there is minimal deviation from the actual program. This is in order to further protect them from bias, the perils of rigidity, and is another plight for how and why the reverse engineered outline is a fantastic reference for the coach. Composition and distribution of stress relative to the perils of rigidity, while encompassing biological and metaphysical costs, lead to many different potential reasons to temporarily provide decreases in stress. These reasons can range from intrapersonal, social, energetic, damage-based, or changes in goal directionality. The athlete's organism does not need to be obliterated for a transition period to be valid. Changes in program direction, athlete goals, time of year, or skill needs can demand a transitory period as well. The term transition is synonymous with deload in the sense that there is an amelioration of imposed stress, but connotation, specifics, and purpose are what separate the two. The accepted definition for a program deload refers to decreasing stress imposed on two of the original 5 pillars of training. The definition is blind to the biological modality in which the deload occurs, timing within a long-term plan, which refers to how to implement it and for how long, foresight, and even purpose. Logically, it is up to the responsible coach to account for these variables, but the ambiguity pushes widespread miscommunication. A deload automatically paints the picture of a lackluster training week that is the same each time, whereas a transition period can be from a few days up to a month and can wear many different hats. In an effort to optimize the effectiveness, communication, and concept of driving a deload, the name must be dispelled in place of a transition period. Secondly, categories of transitions must be created to ensure the changing needs of the athletic organism during the calendar year are met. To encompass the previously mentioned potential issues, Performance Vibe methodology uses the terms clean linens, old clothes, and refitting as the categorical labels for transition programming. Overarchingly, they are respectively split into foresight-based preparation, extension of key previous traits, and non-direction variable-based change. Often, diving deeper, the clean linens transition period is predicated on restoration and preparation. This is most often utilized after a difficult phase of training where a new direction or quality is going to be targeted next. Oftentimes, athletes are drastically unprepared for a novel stress imposition. After a deload of high reps going into heavy loads, for example, there will be a non-specific restoration period for the adaptations made previously and to ameliorate major issues with soreness or muscle damage that may be related. A proper clean linens transition is devoid of stimuli similar to the previous phase and gently introduces coming stressors in a low-cost, ideally game-like manner, which increases preparedness enough to ameliorate negatives that are normally seen in the first week of a major program shift. Old clothes transitions will encompass the majority of transitions throughout the year and are comparatively most similar to the traditional model. The purpose here is to choose most specific stressors previously capitalized on to potentiate performance in the coming phase. During an old clothes transitions, training tasks are recommended to be devoid of novelty, purposefully mirror aspects of the previous phase, and to metaphysically allow the athlete to recover by dropping things that are most difficult or stressful in the athlete's eyes. These three traits are paramount in old clothes transitions as the incoming stressors are typically asking similar demands of the athlete. A proper old clothes transition should utilize coach-athlete synergy to yield a scenario that leaves an athlete with increased preparedness while lacking rigidity in training recommendations themselves. Mentally divorcing from a program for a week is a huge for athlete compliance, as well as increasing favorability of the effort to reward ratio. Lastly, refitting style transitions are meant to encompass unplanned and behavior-driven amelioration of stress. Residing furthest from the original deload concept, refitting is aimed to increase motivation via moderation of intangible variables impacting trainability and does not need a direct biological link between the phases like the previous two categories have intended. Refitting transitions are utilized during times where specific performance and learning are the top priority. This concept is inspired by a key law known as long-term potentiation of neurons, where learning adaptations increase from a sensory exercise when going from more to less stress. This is in fact the opposite of progressive overload. The aim is to drive opportunity toward maximizing the arousal curve and thus behavioral adaptation from what is coming in the coming phase. Whether this is due to a change in event via time or modality, changes in quality of life, athlete goal, or generalized stress capacities being prematurely met in the training program, the recommendations should heavily rely on coach-athlete synergy. The training prescriptions given during refitting transitions should be focused on athlete enjoyment, acute data collection, and be devoid of driving specific adaptation. For example, 7 days of training or a singular session can both be effective during a refitting style transition because of these parameters being set, not being focused on time, and being more focused on the athlete's self-proclaimed state. Albeit, a seemingly minute difference in verbiage and application versus classical deloads, a proper transition period is amongst the most potent tools in the coach's programming arsenal. If properly balanced, monotony and novelty are the true absolute drivers of performance-based periodization, which they are, then transition periods are the bridges to masterfully blend training recommendations together over time. When asking for dramatic effort and compliance from an organism during training, it is simply important to repay the debts accrued via proper transition periods. An ideal transition increases athlete motivation through metaphysical and biological recommendations. There is no drug, protocol, or alluring goal that can replace an athlete's motivation to continue to drive towards success in the long run. Chapter 8, the Tier 1 Peak. Being able to perform beyond baseline capabilities for a short span of time is a captivating concept. The pinnacle of seasonal sports is the cyclic peaking process for fans, coaches, and athletes alike that drive us all to love the sports we do. The most memorable performances involve rising to the occasion when it mattered, and there is a potent neurochemical background to quantify that process. Strongman is a seasonal sport that is heavily predicated on acute performance. On the day of the contest, not a single athlete is in their typical training environment, the accessibility to warm-up is confined, and chaos is now the norm. As in any sport, the athletes who mature and assimilate to the chaos become exceptional performers with high transfer from their training. The competition environment, athlete perception, and accompanied biology create an entire peaking culture containing its own norms, behaviors, and connotation. The social aspect gained from a supporting team is not senseless compliments at all time. An athlete's social reliance system should be placed on having a clear vision in regards to needs, short-term goals, and quality of life. When it comes to competition time, it is especially important to have authentically useful support as each performance will have different demands and criteria. Strongman competitions can be overarchingly placed into three categories: local, national, and world level. Proper preparation then becomes a program design variable when looking at the compositions of the peak, where in the season it falls, and the performance qualities being demanded by the competition. Athletes should have goals for individual competitions as well as seasonal and multi-year ideas they would like to head towards. Logically, someone looking to be top 5 at the world level will have different preparation needs for a local show as opposed to a novice competitor. The program sample attached is aimed to peak any athlete for a local show. There are no complex, hyper-specific, or maximally potent peaking strategies used. Instead, the goal is to orient specific behavior with biology and to pair them with high transfer event practice. This allows athletes to quickly return to training versus the excessive damage accompanied by a major peak, and to ameliorate any potential decreases in qualities missed during sport-specific training throughout the year. The Tier 1 peak is novel in that there are supercompensatory mechanisms enhancing performance, but they are purposefully restrained. This line is paramount to walk as the program is designed to reduce mid-season injury and allow for different sport-specific skills to be optimally trained soon after. The typical Tier 1 program should last no more than 10 to 12 weeks in totality, and Tier 1 programs extending longer are out of scope for the needs of competition, and the time would be more beneficially allocated to training general qualities related to the individual's needs. It's important to remember that a Tier 1 peak can be utilized by any athlete. The program design is centered around the generalized competition demands of a local show. The exercise selection and placement of volume or intensity will be where an athlete's individual difference is explored. However, the intended purpose of the entire program is nearly identical athlete to athlete, regardless of skill level. In an effort to make Tier 1 concepts reproducible, it is divided into 3 phases: alarm, developmental, and peak, with a transition between each. Perhaps the most iconic performance vibe program methodology was inspired by Hans Selye, who coined the term alarm phase. Although it will be discussed with reference to a Tier 1 peak, the alarm phase can be utilized in many different scenarios and even to elicit a competition peak when time is of the essence. An alarm phase is a 2 to 3 week training period with focus on secondary or tertiary priorities, or more specifically, the limiting factors of the developmental block. The reverse engineering of programs becomes essential when answering these questions and managing training variables in real time. For example, an athlete whose top priority is glycolytic proficiency, i.e., when oxygen begins to deplete, performance rapidly does as well, would want to focus on dealing with metabolic waste and oxygen management during their alarm phase. The management of oxygen, lactate, pH, and ions during exercise fit the alarm phase bill perfectly, as these are enzymatic adaptations and can be changed very quickly with a lowered cost of maintenance than larger changes like strength, hypertrophy, or hormone-based adaptation. The program design caveat to alarm phases is they are intended to last no more than 3 weeks and no less than 2. By extending past 3 weeks, it becomes an exuberantly difficult block of training, which is a whole different animal, and anything under 2 weeks will not be consistent enough to drive authentic change. Alarm phases are conceptually predicated on novelty, and the time constraints use the novel stimuli in a monotonous manner. The stress imposed during this phase is novel in of itself. However, the imposition of these novel stressors, session to session, should encompass monotony. This balance creates a small compensatory peak in the desired qualities, ideally enzymatically driven, due to the priorities tackled and the way in which the alarm phase is designed. It is intended to facilitate the next phase of training. Using Le Chatelier's principle conceptually, it is understood that the enzymatic peak driven from the alarm phase will improve capacity to do work during the developmental block and increase potential for adaptation, assuming recovery is adequate. This can be tangibly seen via acute performance changes, ability to recover, and the amelioration of cost from the same types of work. As noted in the attached program, once the concepts and stressors have been chosen, it is monotony within this small span of time that drives specific alarm style changes. It is logical to separate physiological training, oxygen, pH, and waste management, from the performance-oriented portions, like skill, grit, and decision-making, due to soreness and acute fatigue induced from stressors' novelty. Overarchingly, the alarm phase serves as an incredible priming tool and can be generalized for our function in any performance modality. The developmental phase of the Tier 1 peak is the least behaviorally centered and most focused on acute physiological change. Enzymatic and grit-focused changes seen in the alarm phase are to increase the potency of the actual training protocols featured in the developmental phase. Strongman is iconic for preparation time being short. Thus, the time spent on the performance-based adaptation needs to be perfectly placed. The athletes must be systemically prepared to deal with the incoming stress. Alarm phases are only 2 to 3 weeks long and enzymatically focused due to the fact that extending outward from there will cause excess damage to respond to, thus increasing time until the next opportunity for stress imposition. The actual exercise prescriptions must be potent and accurately directed towards desired change due to chronic time constraints in prep, with emphasis on enough damage to cause acute change that can be maintained versus long-term adaptation in the developmental phase. As strongman is a primarily non-oxidative glycolytic sport where intensity, via load or perception, is the typical means of inhibiting performance, it is logical that the developmental portion of the Tier 1 peaking program is centered around that. Alarm phases are designed to increase the return on the athlete's effort during the portion of training, and the exercise prescriptions must be intensely athlete-specific while only being semi-specific to the competition. The 4 to 6 weeks spent in the developmental portion of training typically focus on contractility, decreasing the cost of high cardiac output, and glycogen storage. It is recommended to keep muscle damage high, yet varied within the glycolytic realm. Imagine the delineation between pump or strength work while still being deprived of oxygen, and to utilize conjugated event practice. The terms semi-specific and practice are used when referencing the competition, as they are the secondary focus to the primary adaptations sought after. Assuming the reverse engineering process was done correctly, primary adaptations in the developmental phase will have the highest return on investment relative to overall performance, and the skill-oriented event practice will have a semi-specific, positive accent on how the performance is modulated. Understand that although specific to the athlete, the qualities being chased in developmental phases of training are typically general, and the conjugate peppering of event skill training molds the crest of the adaptational tidal wave and thus termed semi-specific or adequate/proficient transfer. This terminology is relative to peaking, where event training is the primary stressor and the maximum transfer to sport is being sought after there. The Tier 1 peak is characterized by cluster-oriented exercise prescriptions and is typically enjoyable in nature relative to the previous two blocks of training, as well as event skill-based training recommendations becoming a priority versus semi-specific practice. At this point, the athlete has developed as much primary quality adaptation as possible while maintaining beneficial enzymatic alterations from the alarm phase. Essentially, the aim is to create an organism primed for molding by sport-specific training prescriptions that ultimately characterize the peak. Due to previous programming decisions, Tier 1 peaks should be less glycolytic and more alactic or phosphogenic in nature if optimal progress is in mind. When zooming into the bioenergetics of strongman, it is noted that the line between the phosphagen system and glycolysis is where the contest demands predominantly reside, meaning that the majority of time spent resynthesizing ATP during competition performance falls between the depletion of the phosphagen system and the onset of the glycolytic. Cluster sets are the perfect match for the Tier 1 peak as they fall within the desired methods of ATP resynthesization in strongman and allow for greater neurological integrity, along with driving competition-like behavior change, grit, focus with high heart rate and cardiac output, aggression, etc. A typical TPV accent to increase bioenergetic specificity in the Tier 1 peak is to lightly tax organelles and deplete glycogen in the key muscle groups for the peak on a different training day. This is a highly effective tool in the Tier 1 peaking process as it will facilitate the supercompensatory actions of clusters in an individual-specific as well as sport-specific manner. The caveat is this prior depletion will not impede the performance of cluster work due to previous training adaptations and the role of nutrition, which is the main means of recovery from that type of stress. Phenomenologically, the peak training itself may feel and actually be more difficult to complete. However, the massive amounts of clientele who have successfully undergone these methods have shown that grit traverses this paradigm and performance does not decrease, and in fact, the adaptations after are greater. This is another plight for properly reverse engineering the program and selecting proper traits in the alarm phase. The behavioral adaptations during the Tier 1 peak mirror that of the alarm phase, but are now specific to the event demands relative to the athlete. For example, a max lift has a different optimal behavior strategy and accompanied biology than a lift requiring double-digit repetitions. This blended Tier 1 program design allows for the athlete to have a moderate performance-enhancing peak that is oriented around rising to the occasion metaphysically. As previously mentioned, the Tier 1 peak is predicated on the concept of crush it and move on. The final portion to be managed in the Tier 1 peaking systems are the 2 transition weeks, which come after the alarm phase and prior to the peaking portion. Transitions are paramount for neurologically facilitating learning, acute preparedness, and ensuring that adaptations are blended into each other properly. For example, if you were to go from short rest sets of 10 directly into heavy sets of 4 with ample rest, not only would there be major dysregulation on the muscular level, seen by DOMs, inability to perform, decreased capacity, It would also impede the nervous system's ability to improve contractility, form integrity, speed, and increase risk of injury. In this scenario, there would be a decreased ability to endure the phase of training, as well as diminished adaptation. Especially when time is of the essence, it is incredibly important to focus on optimizing each and every training decision made. The first transition comes directly after the cessation of the alarm phase and is an old clothes modeled week. Oftentimes, there is a seemingly exponential increase in progress, as well as acute increases in preparedness seen in the alarm phase due to rapid changes in myocellular organelles, structural, and enzymatic-based changes. The generalized training stress and ability of these systems to recover quickly create a perfect opportunity to extend out training prescriptions while ameliorating systemic and generalized stress. This concept allows for total system recovery while promoting the most important variables to progress a tad bit further, thus extending their ability in the developmental block and ameliorating the need to maintain these crucial adaptations. The second transition, coming prior to the peaking portion, is the complete opposite in that it is a clean linens deload with emphasis on wiping the neurological slate clean. This is simpler in program design, and its success is heavily predicated on the athlete's ability to make correct choices. A proper clean linens transition week is the best option because of the significant amounts of myotrauma in the developmental phase that have occurred and the incoming emphasis placed on sport-specific behavioral skills. The developmental portion of the program causes vast and varied amounts of damage that should be ideally completely taken care of prior to peaking. Secondarily, the clean linens transition week is meant to ensure the potential for interference is as low as possible. Going from a developmental strict press protocol into competition-style pressing with more frequency than before could cause acute and chronic issues with form integrity, confidence, as well as performance. However, by simply placing some sport-specific alactic work during the transition week, the athlete will be bioenergetically and neurologically more prepared to begin the changes in training. This is paramount in ensuring the athlete has the motivation to attack the protocols laid out. The Tier 1 peak purposefully puts the performance organism in a suboptimal scenario to force metaphysical change that will transfer to individual-specific event performance. For example, someone who falters to complete pressing reps when fatigue is high and short time remains will be training their press almost exclusively with a lack of oxygen, high heart rate, and fatigued legs. Placing these two transition weeks properly and maximizing coach-athlete communication is the optimizing accent to the Tier 1 program as a whole. Chapter 9, Closing Thoughts. Humans cannot properly exist in any type of culture without some specific aim. Whether the individual's aim is simply to not descend further downward in the social hierarchy or to ruthlessly rise to the very top, it is imperative that the metaphysical mind has an avenue to traverse. Even bad habits are a metaphysical avenue for someone to walk down. Think, an addict going to take forward steps towards getting their daily fix. Satisfaction is chronically derived from taking steps towards that aim. Hence the need for details, rituals, and markers of progress that are blind of connotation. The beauty of metaphysics rests on the fact that every portion of the journey, aim, and route taken to get there is predicated on individual desire and connotation, not that of the surrounding culture. If something does not spark authentic interest, it is exponentially more difficult to walk that path. Recognizing that fact gives the individual great power over their own self-worth and perception. Strongman training and the science surrounding it are enjoyable details for a specific type of person to include on their path. There is no need to be highly educated or have complete understanding of biology for these things to have a positive impact on quality of life. Improvement of day-to-day life, as well as performance, is heavily weighted on individual perception. If an athlete enjoys the tasks and has an understanding of how it applies to their specific needs, then all the satisfaction required to move forward will be accounted for. Drowning in complexity or loving each piece of the puzzle game are two sides of the same coin. The phenomenology of things covered in this book are completely up to the reader's interpretation and how they defend the potential for life change. For some, it may be nothing more than a sensation. For others, the expended effort gives immediate satisfaction, and some require additional proof to comfort the white noise arguing against the presented information. The lack of references provided is in an effort to avoid spoon-feeding information and the compensatory defense of the years of valid work creating performance vibe methods. Biology, research, and training methods are shared across the entire field, but do not make anything more real to the person. Time is relative, yet the human clock is not, making just about every choice made in life glorified entertainment. The second book of the trilogy will include focused insight on the performance vibe long-term development model, specific program design avenues to be utilized, as well as the second tier of peaking. Zooming in and out at key times with topics including the construction of the long-term development model will also capture the training week, block development, highlighted programming methods, and the reasoning behind selection of physiological adaptations. The second tier of peaking is aimed towards neurological and creatine phosphate changes using past action potentiation as its main driving force. This first book was aimed to give a broad understanding of performance vibe perspective on the biology shared across the human race and understanding a basic model of how we would lead into a local strongman show and peak for it. With the foundation developed in this book, the second will be almost entirely centered around applicable information, methods, and tactics regarding the implementation of performance-altering program design. Coaching modalities will never be more than avenues for an organism to traverse. It is the quest an athlete chooses to walk that is most real to them. Hence, the job of the practitioner will never extend past aiding and taking someone from point A to point B. The overarching goal that should be chased when creating training recommendations that extend to biological tools should be what an athlete can actually use to vibe out or maximize their satisfaction in training itself. Winning is a cultural badge of recognition, but only gives acute satisfaction. Authentic pride is generated from within. Thank you so much for bearing with me through my entire reading of the Tier 1 ebook, and please continue to comment, share, subscribe, interact with us, and as always, vibe out.